Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. All right, everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast. I'm excited today to be releasing the first of what is going to be a series of episodes where I highlight just kind of the scaffolding and then some basic examples of how I go through a training cycle, both on the preparation from the training side of things, as well as my nutritional approach to those different phases of the training cycle. So this is going to be a 4-part series where I outline in the 4 main categories that I would consider the cycle that I go through when I'm training for ultramarathons. That is my off-season, my base building phase, my speed work development phase, and then ultimately my ultramarathon long run development phase. So I list them and label them like that because I am typically peaking for and training for races that are likely around the 100-mile distance. And I do follow an approach when it comes to training philosophy, whether you're training for shorter endurance events like Olympic distance stuff, or if you're doing longer ultramarathons like mine. The order of operations tends to be an important piece to that in terms of it's not as much about whether you should or should not do a specific workout. It's more about when maybe you should do it. So I say that just to highlight when I go through this 4-part series and I touch on these different parts of the training cycle, I am following that approach, and I'm following that approach in effort to target a duration or intensity that would be something similar to what I've done for 100 miles in the past. So that's kind of the context of all of it. I also want to encourage people to think of it through the framework of this is what I have done. So to a large degree, there are components here that I think are good takeaways, generally speaking, but there's also a lot of stuff that's very specific to me at the individual level. So I encourage you to think of it like this. There are oftentimes some really good recommendations to start from at the end at a population level, and you can run through those and find out how you respond to them, and then begin kind of piecing together what parts you want to keep and what parts you maybe want to change on the individual level to best optimize things for you, your specific circumstances, your specific goals. I think one of the more interesting things I've learned as a coach over the years is that everyone's goals are different. And some people have goals of like, I want to cross a finish line, figuring out how fast I can run this distance or this time frame, and everything else comes secondary. And then there's other people who are a bit on the other side of that spectrum where, yeah, they want to compete to the best of their ability within the framework that they have available, but they're more interested in things like health and well-being, and they're maybe willing to make some compromises to get a higher degree of that versus always targeting performance. And thinking of it through that lens is that everyone kind of has a different target point. This is more or less mine and the way I structure to try to achieve that. All right, so let's hop into the first of the 4-part series, which is going to be the off-season. And the off-season, I like to break this into basically kind of 2 phases or 2 parts. And the way to maybe think about it generally is the off-season is broken into the unstructured and the structured portion of the off-season. So when I'm looking at an off-season and sort of defining it, I'm defining it as a time frame where I am not necessarily focusing on inputs that are directly targeted at improving my performance for peaking. So the stuff I'm doing in the off-season, they're not unhelpful for performance. In fact, they are a necessary aspect to make sure that I am ready to get myself in a position where I can peak. But to some degree, it's a little bit of I'm going to take a step back, catch my breath so that I can take a bigger step forward in the future. And this just usually means I'm focusing on getting my body and my mind recharged and ready to go. So one question I always ask myself throughout an off season is, are you ready to go through both the physical and mental rigors of the training cycle that will keep things as exciting and as meaningful as it was last time? So if I get ahead of myself and exit off season and into the next phase of training too soon, there's just an increased likelihood that I'll find myself partway through that next phase of training feeling like if I had just taken a little extra time, I'd be more motivated, more excited, more fresh, more determined. All the little things that add up to kind of reaching your full potential versus getting partially the way there. So I'm very mindful of kind of how my prior experience has led me to certain scenarios with that. I would be lying to you if I told you that every time I've done an off-season, I've executed it perfectly to the degree where I exited it and I had as much motivation as I've ever had through the entire cycle and then the race itself. You know, there's been times where I have cut my off-season a little too short, found out about that later on in the training cycle or the race itself, and then realized, hey, I need to be more mindful about the way I navigate an off-season in order to maintain that optimal experience with that next build up. So keep that in mind as you're kind of listening to this and kind of taking any bits of advice or pieces of feedback that I may have in here that are specific to kind of your own circumstances as well. But back to the off-season structure. So the first part of that is that unstructured phase. So the unstructured phase, that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm going to just sit on the couch and do nothing. What it means is I'm not going to force myself to do anything. And I'm definitely not going to force myself to do running specific things. So like going out for a run for is the most direct example of that. I'm not going to hold myself accountable to do any specific thing there. It doesn't mean I can't do it. It means if I would wake up one morning and think, hey, I'm kind of curious about how my legs are feeling, maybe I'll go for a run. Let's say I decide to do that. That's not off the table. But if I go out there and begin that run and I recognize maybe 10, 15 minutes into it that, okay, this isn't fun, this feels forced, this isn't enjoyable, I will stop immediately. I'm not going to hold myself accountable the way I might feel like partway through a big training cycle where I've got a long run on the schedule, I've got a little bit of residual fatigue in my legs, and I know I have the right rest, stress, kind of back and forth going, and it's just staying motivated. I might force myself to do a run where I'm not necessarily excited about doing it or as excited about doing it, but I know it's going to be, you know, something that helps me get to where I want to get. I'm not doing any of that in the off season. I will cut a workout short immediately at the very first sign of any lack of motivation, any lack of interest, and either pivot to something completely different or just completely rest. So I like to move. I find that movement is something that is beneficial even for the recovery process if done right. So a lot of times in this early phase of unstructured off-season, I'll be doing movement type stuff. It'll often be things though that are either like indirectly useful in terms of what it would be for running. So maybe I'll get out and do a bike ride. Maybe I haven't done this as recently living in warmer climates, but go skiing or something like that, hiking, stuff like that are going to be like get my body out and active so I don't feel like I'm just like a couch potato the entire time, but I'm really not stressing the system. I really much think of this through the lens of like, do something that gets your body moving, but don't force it. Don't put yourself in a position where you feel like after you finish this, you need recovery from it. It should feel like it's actually like energizing you. And that's kind of like the guide I'll use is this activity I'm doing actually energizing me and making me more excited for the training to come versus feeling like, okay, I just did a stimulus. I need to bounce back from that now. So think of it like this. It's a focus on movement and a focus on fun. And if it ever becomes anything more than that, you're probably doing too much and it's time to kind of back off a little bit. So usually I'll get to a point after, let's say, a goal race, usually it's as early as 2 weeks, sometimes even sooner, where like I'm starting to get to the point where I can add some structure back. And some structure is likely useful, but it's just not something where I'm at a point where I'm ready to throw myself right back into the thick of it, where I'm doing training inputs similar to what I would be doing in the middle of a training cycle. So I start adding some structure to my lifestyle, but I try to be very deliberate about it. So in the off season, one of the first things I'll usually start to structure or add back as structure is strength work, because I think strength work is a very important piece to the puzzle. I find for myself specifically when I can get a good strength work structure in place before I kind of start the structured running related stuff, I tend to be more consistent with it. It becomes part of the framework. It becomes something that's a little bit more of a non-negotiable in the way I kind of go about my day and the way I plan things. And I tend to get better results from it when I do that. And I also think it's just a great time to start that process too, because you do have this interchange between strength work and your more running specific workouts where the strength work is good, but if you overdo it or you position it improperly, you can find that it will negatively impact your running performance because you're stealing from your opportunity to actually fully immerse yourself in the activity that you're trying to improve. So as I'm kind of figuring out how much volume and at what types of things I'm able to do with strength work in that early part of the training cycle in the second half of that off season, if I do make a mistake and just lift a little too much one day and I'm a little more sore the following day than I would like to be during my training cycle of running specific structure, I didn't make that mistake that's going to actually compromise an upcoming running workout because I haven't even structured any of that yet. If that happens and I wake up the next day and I'm like, hey, had I been a little bit more soft in the gym doing the strength work yesterday, I'd probably feel pretty optimistic and good about just this nice, easy 45-minute exploratory run or something like that. And I have to couch that because I'm not motivated to do that anymore because I'm a little more sore than I should be. It's really not an opportunity cost I'm concerned with because it's not necessarily a running workout that I would include in this is something you need to check off the box of list of things to do in order to be ready for the race you're trying to prepare for. So when I develop my strength structure, I'm usually focusing on I break it into kind of two categories. I'll do like a strength training day that focuses on upper body and core, and then I'll focus on a strength work day that is more lower body focused. And within that, I'm going to be looking at it through the lens of I probably want to make sure I get at least 1 day per week of each of those categories. So 1 day upper body and core and another day lower body per week. And I'm probably fine going up to as much as 2 of those per week. So that could be somewhere between 2 days per week or 4 days per week. You could get creative and say, all right, well, I want to do 1 day per week of all those, but I go to the gym 1 day per week, or I have access to gym equipment 1 day a week. I'm just going to do the whole thing on 1 day. You could do that. It's just a higher volume input on those days. So you do want to keep in mind just the balance between quality and duration and how that kind of distributes itself. So if it's a scenario where it doesn't matter to you, but by doing all of it in 1 day versus breaking it up the way that I typically do, puts you in a position where you start kind of fading at the end of the session because you're getting to those final lifts and you've been there for a while and it's just difficult to execute at a high quality. That's where I start to say looking at it through the lens of make sure you're hitting the prescribed workouts at the highest quality possible, and breaking that up is going to be a better move if you maintain that quality versus compressing it together and potentially losing some of that quality at the end. Here are some discounts and promos for the HPO sponsors. Delta G Ketones has 20% off with BITTER20 promo code, and they also offer free consultations to help you assess how their product would best fit your lifestyles. Head to deltagketones.com. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack with purchase and a satisfaction guarantee, meaning if you don't like it, they will give you your money back, no questions asked, and you don't even have to return the box. Go to drinklmnt.com/HPO to get that free sample pack and try out all their flavors with your purchase. John G. Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. Check out their AFO shorts if you're in the market for a new pair of running or gym shorts. That's johng.com, JANJI.com. S Fuels has a 15% site-wide discount. Go to sfuelsgolonger.com. All links, promos, and discounts can be found in the show notes as well as every episode landing page. Some other things that I'll kind of include within like the strength work side of things, or I consider it as like kind of like supplementary work, is mobility. So I'll also start to get a little more structured around kind of my mobility routine. And this is really something that I don't necessarily follow my rules as closely with this. It's just not something I feel like I really need to recover from. So there may be a few days, like let's say I go and I run a 100-mile race and then I wake up the next morning, I'm probably not going to be like, all right, let's get this mobility routine in. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing to do. It's just not something that I feel like I need the cognitive load to force myself to do. But it's definitely the thing that I could easily bring back first without a huge consequence, either from a mental or physical recovery standpoint. So the mobility routine, sometimes I actually kind of crave it in those like days following a run because you're kind of tight, you're kind of stiff, and just getting and getting down and doing some mobility work that isn't really like stressing the body at all, it actually just feels good to kind of get those tight muscles, just a little bit of movement. But I do pay attention to that stuff too, even if I am doing a mobility routine, I'm like, this is just like pulling teeth. I'll bail out on something like that when it's in that kind of early phase of the off season. But this is something I want to try to get very consistent with early on, just like the strength work. So between the two of those things, some examples of the strength work I do for upper body, this would include things like push-ups, pull-ups, lateral pull-downs, overhead press, bended pull-aparts. So that's usually like a band where I'm like I'm taking a band. I'm kind of think of it like a rubber band, and you're just like keeping your hands together, and then you're gradually pulling them apart until your arms are out like a wingspan, basically. And dumbbell rows. Those make up some pretty common movements that I will embed into my upper body strength work. The core stuff is a lot of times like planks, both front and side planks, leg raises, cable twists, both high where the cable is raised up well above my head and low where it's down closer to waist, and then hanging knee raises. For some of the lower body inputs that I tend to focus on and include things like hex bar deadlifts, Bulgarian split squats, weighted lunges, both forward and backward, kettlebell swings, weighted glute bridges, weighted tibialis raises, weighted calf raises, sled, push and pull. And this is in this phase when I'm putting it in the lower body side of things, it tends to be a little bit of a heavier movement versus what I've done at some point in the past where I'll actually do a continuous push-pull sled lower intensity thing where it's not overly heavy and I'm not pushing hard. I'm actually keeping it closer to like a zone 1 intensity from a heart rate perspective, but I'm just going back and forth with that sled. This would be a little bit of a different when I'm putting it in that lower body phase of things where I'm actually going to do it more in a 3 set of 10 type of framework with a heavier push and pull version of that. And then also like weighted hip abductor and adductor. This is usually something I'll do on a machine. Or if I don't have access to a machine, I can use like a bench and kind of do it as like a side plank mechanic. And things like clamshells where I'm maybe putting like a resistance band around it and walking laterally back and forth, or side to side, I should say, back and forth. Some of the mobility movements that I tend to focus on include ankle rotations. So this can be something as simple as like I'll be on my back with the leg I'm working on raised up at kind of like a 90-degree angle, and I'll do like 60-second rotations clockwise, 60-second rotations counterclockwise, 60 seconds doing kind of just like the dorsal and plantar flexion. So it's like 3 minutes for each ankle or foot to do that. Then I'll work on some hip stuff where I'll put my right leg on my left thigh while I'm on my back still in that same position. And then I'll just raise that hip complex up for about 60 seconds, just hold it statically like that. I'll do some static ankle dorsiflexion where I'll have my back legs raised up onto a bench and then have a block kind of between my feet. And then I'll dorsal flex in. So think of it like you're laying on the ground. You have your legs braced up on a bench. You have like a yoga block or something pinched between your feet, and then you're dorsal flexing or pulling your legs back towards you and just holding that statically for like 10 minutes is what I'll be working up to for that. The other thing I'll do is I'll be working on shoulder too. So this is maybe something a little more specific to me where I do have what I identified is like my shoulders need to be worked on from a mobility standpoint in order for my running form to run smoothly through my gait cycle. So one thing I do to kind of keep that going is I'll do forward and backward shoulder rotations where I'll be sitting upright on a bench with my arms out like, full wingspan, and I'll be doing forward and backward rotations with engaging that shoulder complex. Finally, then for the mobility stuff, I'll be, again, on my back, legs 90 degrees with my feet up on the wall. And what I'll do with that is I'll be thinking of it as like a hinge on my outer foot, where while I'm on my back, my legs up on a wall at roughly like a 90-degree angle, I'll just be moving my knees in and out, hinging on the outside of my foot. So it's basically opening and closing that hip area with using the wall and the outsides of my feet as the hinge. And I'll be doing that for about 3 minutes. If you're interested in a visual for that particular routine, that mobility routine, if you head to my Instagram account, which is just at Zach Bitter, I actually have it as one of my pinned reels right now. So go ahead and go check that out if you want a visual of any of those mobility movements that I have there. So that's kind of like what I will have as like the first structural input for my off season. What I'll end up doing then is once I do get to a point, and this is usually maybe a couple weeks into the off season, where I'll start to get to a point where I think doing some running is going to be useful. I'll do some test runs just to gauge kind of how my body's feeling, confirming whether I'm actually ready for it or not. Once I kind of get that green light in my mind that I'm ready to start adding a little bit of running back into it, I'll spend a couple weeks with just some like unstructured running where I'm going to go out for a run the next day. I'm not really too concerned about what that distance or duration actually is or what the intensity is. I'm just going to listen to my body and start kind of going through that motion of adding some running back into the plan in an unstructured way. And once I start feeling like that is going in a good direction, that's kind of my signal that I'm ready to exit the off season and add some structure back into the training cycle and kind of pivot into that base building phase of training. So I'll talk about this in much more detail during the base building phase. But one thing I do always keep in mind is when you exit off season and enter base building phase, it's not all right, let's get back to full throttle training the way it was in the middle of the training cycle. You want the beginning of the base building phase and the exit of the off season phase to be a gradual return. And again, I'll talk about more about how that gradual return looks during the base building phase of the series that I'm recording. All right, so the next piece to this first episode is the nutrition structure. So this is where, in general, I think my nutritional approach, which I would define as a low carbohydrate diet approach that ranges in how low it goes depending on where I am in the training cycle. This phase of the training, my nutrition is going to be closest that it will be to like what people would maybe consider like a strict ketogenic diet, where carbohydrate inputs are so low that you basically aren't eating many at all. If most people going about this way of eating are going to look at what they ate at the end of the day and be like, I didn't eat any carbohydrates. In reality, there are some there. They're just not very recognizable the way they would be in like a more moderate to high carbohydrate diet where they make up the majority of or the foundation of the training approach. So the way this likely looks is, like I said, the lowest carb input for me of the year. And part of this is also just energy output. This phase of the year, I'm usually at my lowest energy output, meaning I'm just doing less physical activity. So my actual energy demand during this phase of the training year is at its lowest. So I don't necessarily need as much food to maintain weight. Now, I'm also thinking in the off season, I'm not afraid to gain some weight in the off season. In fact, a lot of times I actually value gaining a few pounds during the off season. And the reason being is when I start the base building phase, it's of no consequence if I'm a few pounds overweight. It may actually be better for me because I sort of have a little bit of a built-in buffer then that if I do make a few mistakes or have a few workouts or a few days where I have a caloric deficit just because I did a lot of work and I just didn't eat as much as I needed to replace all of that, I sort of have that buffer built in as I'm ramping back up into things. And I don't have to necessarily worry so much about being as diligent about hitting those targets early on in that. So when I get to the part of the training where like I'm in a speed work development phase or the longer development phase, at that point usually I'm kind of more back to kind of where I would fit kind of a framework of what I would consider like my race weight, in which case then I'm going to be like hyper vigilant about making sure that I'm hitting targets to maintain weight versus lose weight and end up kind of losing out on not fueling myself for what I'm trying to get to. But again, I think off season, given that my output is lower, it's a little more relaxed time of year in terms of gaining weight. I don't necessarily mind if I gain a little bit of extra weight during the off season. In fact, I think that's probably a value add in most cases. So it is usually the lowest carb input of the year for me. At times, this can be as low as about 5% of my intake. So like I said, similar to a strict ketogenic diet, it's usually like somewhere in the neighborhood of like 70 to 80% fat and around 15 to 20% protein. And somewhere around 5 to maybe 10% carbohydrate. And like I said, at times, sometimes even under 5% if I just happen to, get that low on a specific day. I'm not too picky about making sure it has to be below 5%. It just depends. Some off seasons I've gotten more strict with that, and it's because I'm just interested in it or more curious with it, where other times I'm like, okay, I've been through this system enough times. I know the experience well enough. I don't necessarily like need to do a strict below 5% like intake of carbohydrates to get what I'm looking for from this. And I might be a little bit closer to that 10% number. But generally speaking, if we look at averages over the course of about the 13 years I've been doing a low carbohydrate approach, that's about where they're going to land if you add up all those off seasons over those years together. What I would say in terms of advice for people who have never done a low carbohydrate diet or maybe curious about doing it is the first time you go through this, if you're going to do any version of a strict ketogenic diet, I almost always recommend doing this during the off season for some of the stuff that I've talked about already, which is it's just of low consequence in terms of your performance. So as you kind of go through the adjustment period that is going to happen if you're switching your macronutrient profile that drastically, it's not going to come at an opportunity cost of what you're trying to do when you're in a full training cycle and trying to maximize your performance. So you can really learn kind of what it feels like to actually follow a strict ketogenic diet and decide whether that's a level of restriction you even want to entertain at all, whether it's in your off season or during your season or anything for that matter. I like personal experiences for stuff like this because everyone's just different. I've talked to people, I've coached people where they just really love the way that they feel and just the inputs and just everything that goes into kind of basically eliminating carbohydrates. So, for someone like that, they really like this phase of the year. And in some cases, they're going to stick something closer to this throughout their entire training because that's a big priority for theirs versus trying to find whatever the most optimal nutrition approach might be. They may say, hey, sticking to a strict ketogenic diet is my number one priority. Whatever performance I get out of it from there is secondary. I do think if you're going to embark on a low carbohydrate approach, it's not a bad idea to at least give yourself, say, a few weeks, a month, maybe 2 months or so following something that's maybe a little more close to a strict ketogenic diet just to get that experience. That's just kind of maybe a personal interest that I value. So you can maybe look at that and think to yourself, yeah, that's not me. Forget about it and take it as is. But I think just having that experience can sometimes be like give you a valuable individual look at to kind of what that actually means. So then when you hear people talking about like a strict ketogenic diet, you got a more of a personal look into what exactly that entails with that stuff. So with that, that's kind of the macronutrient side of things. There are essentially an endless number of inputs that you can use to get to those numbers. And this is where I think the creativity and the intrigue and the curiosity can become useful. For me, one of the reasons why I think that I've been able to stick to a lower carbohydrate diet and at times during the off seasons even flex down to something closer to a strict ketogenic diet is because I haven't gotten too hung up on saying this input is bad, that input is good. I've been flexible over the years of what those inputs are so that I can kind of still have some variance of change or something to look forward to so I don't feel like I'm just always rinsing and repeating the same thing over and over again. Some people are different like that. They're just like, hey, I want this really tight list of things that are on the list of what to do. I'm just going to stick to those. I'm not going to deviate from those. And they're going to have what would be considered on average an even more restrictive version of the diet. And if that works for them, great. For me, I like to have that kind of available opportunity to say, hey, I'm going to focus on these inputs for a while to get to that macronutrient target. Maybe next time I'll focus on some different ones, or maybe I'll be like wide open and kind of have a whole list of different things I can use to hit those macronutrients. But for the purposes of this episode, I'm just going to list some of the staples that I have used throughout the 13 years that I have done this stuff. So you have an idea of when I'm in this off-season phase, these are often some things that find themselves on my grocery list very often. This doesn't mean it's total in the sense that it's everything I would ever have and I never deviate from it. This is just, the way to think about this is like, this is where I'm going to build the foundation of things. And there are going to be times where I deviate from this and have things that aren't on this list. They're just not going to be things that are going to be like things that I would consider like a frequent thing that I would have on a regular basis over the span of the years that I've done it. I'm also not including in this list supplements and sports products that I would normally use, because that has changed a fair bit as well over the years as I've kind of gone through that sort of stuff. So what I do have, though, is at the end of each one of these episodes for this series is I have a sample day. And on those sample days, I did include those products in there, so you can get an idea of kind of maybe where they would fit in that rotation when you're getting like a kind of like a more of an acute look at what like a sample day may look like. That is more or less being pulled mostly from this grocery list. But some of the historic inputs would include things like coconut oil, olive oil, canola oil, sunflower oil, butter or ghee, lard or tallow, full fat salad dressings, fatty cuts of beef, pork, lamb, chicken and turkey, preferably with the skin in the cases with those type of things, fatty fish like salmon, whole eggs, bacon and sausages, organ meats, and things like liver have been some of the organ meats I've had in the past when I'm kind of going that direction. Full fat cheeses like cheddar, brie, mozzarella, etc. Heavy creams, sour cream, full fat yogurts, cream cheese, coconut milk unsweetened. So not like those cartons of like coconut milk as like a milk replacement, but the condensed stuff that you would get for like cooking a curry or something like that. Almonds, macadamia nuts, pecans, walnuts, chia seeds, flax seeds, hemp seeds, pumpkin seeds, leafy greens like spinach, kale, and Swiss chard, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, zucchini, cucumbers, asparagus, avocado, eggplant, bell peppers, berries like strawberries, raspberries, and blackberries. Since this is a part of the phase where I'm doing very low carbohydrate, the fruits that I do have are typically ones that are low in carbohydrate because I am keeping those quite low. And then coffee. So that's kind of like a sample list of things that have moved in and out at a frequent enough basis over the 13 years that I've been low carbohydrate in this phase of training, that if you came over and spent some time with me, you'd see those things in the fridge oftentimes. In terms of like a sample day, I've got a sample day that includes what I did for training and what I did for nutrition. So this actual sample day came from kind of the second half of the off season where I did have some structure back, but the structure was entirely in the strength work mobility side of that equation. So for this particular day, the one thing I did have on the schedule that was structured was a lower body strength session. And that was a 3x10 hex bar deadlift, 3x10 dumbbell Bulgarian split squats, 3x10 dumbbell box steps, 3x10 abductor machine, 3x10 adductor machine, 3x10 weighted tibialis raises, 3x10 weighted calf raises, and then a 30-minute sled push-pull at a low intensity. The nutrition that went into that day was I had 3 ounces of walnuts, 6 large eggs, 2 teaspoons of canola oil, 10 teaspoons of olive oil, 8 ounces of spinach, 1 cup of plain full-fat yogurt, 2 cups of broccoli, 5 ounces of salmon, 2 tablespoons of heavy cream, 2 ounces of sharp cheddar cheese, 2 scoops of S Fuels Train, half a packet of Element chocolate electrolytes, 1 cup of strawberries, and those totals came out to 2,626 calories, which were 129.5 grams of protein, which made up 19.7% of the intake for that day, 48.3 grams of carbohydrates, which came out to 7.3% of the intake for that day, 206.4 grams of fat, which came out to 71% of my calories for that day. All right, folks, so that is kind of the basic structure and breakdown of the first phase of my training cycle, which is the off season. I encourage you to tune in for the next version of this, which is the base building phase, which will be followed by a speed work development phase, and then the ultra specific long run development phase of my training. As a way to thank the listeners for helping me grow this podcast over the years, I'm going to continue a raffle option for all of you to have a chance to win a free consultation with me. So it's a 30-minute consultation that I will raffle off once per month. All you have to do to enter is share the episodes that you enjoy on whatever platform you find most interesting. The only thing I ask you to do is, if it's a social media channel, make sure you tag me so I see it and can save that and enter in the raffle. Or if it's somewhere else that you can't tag me at, take a screenshot and send that to me at hpopodcast@gmail.com. You can also enter the raffle by writing a show review on your favorite podcast listening platform. So if you do that, take the screenshot, send it to hpopodcast@gmail.com, and I will enter you in that monthly raffle. Also, I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So to go along with my personalized one-on-one coaching options and my pre-made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So this model is set up so that whether you're a beginner or advanced, you can join. Whether you're training for something like a 5K or something as far as a 200 plus miler, you are welcome, and this setup will help you reach your goals. The way I have it set up is if you subscribe, you will have access to my full catalog of training plans, which range from beginner 5K all the way up to advanced 200 plus miles. Along with that plan that you're going to use, you will have access to a weekly group meeting where you can ask questions about training. You can ask about adjustments to the plan to make it more personalized to you. You can engage with the other group members if you want. We'll get you all set up and ready to really personalize that plan to make sure that you're heading in the right direction for your event. Also, you will have access to office hours where if you have something you want to ask and you want to just hop in and ask a question, you'll be given access to that as well. I will be bringing in guest speakers who have a deep understanding of specific topics and things that we'll use to better your training and recovery process throughout the course of the year, as well as a private forum for all the members to engage with one another, share stories, share training tips, and just house a lot of the information that we'll go over on the daily and weekly basis as you're pursuing your race goals. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group. If you're interested in keeping up with what I'm up to, please give me a follow on some of my socials. Follow me on Instagram at ZachBitter, on X, Twitter at ZBitter, and check out the brand new HPO podcast handles, which are just at HPO Podcast on Instagram and X/Twitter. Of course, all this stuff can be found quite easily on my website, which is the main landing page for everything I do at zachbitter.com. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.